Maya Turner stood at the threshold of Willowbrook General Hospital, a prestigious institution nestled in the heart of an affluent suburban community. The building's gleaming exterior and polished reputation promised excellence, a beacon of hope for patients seeking the best care. Yet, as Maya took her first steps inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital's high status came with an unspoken cost she was about to pay. Despite the gleaming halls and the sterile orderliness of the place, there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface, and Maya felt it keenly. A nurse who had worked tirelessly to earn her position, Maya had always known that her journey in the medical field wouldn't be easy. Raised by a mother who had instilled in her a sense of resilience, Maya knew she had to work harder than her peers to prove her worth. She'd spent countless nights studying, acing exams, and enduring the subtle dismissals that came with being a black woman in an industry that often overlooked her. But Maya's strength had carried her through, and she graduated at the top of her class, determined to make a difference. When she walked into Willowbrook that first day, she held her head high, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The first thing she noticed was the silence. As she approached the nurse's station, conversation seemed to stutter and die, eyes darting away from hers, as if the very presence of a new nurse, especially one who was black, was an unwelcome disruption. The polite smiles were thinly veiled, and the subtle coldness in the air was unmistakable. But Maya, accustomed to being the only in spaces, steeled herself. She had endured these moments before, and wasn't about to let them define her. Still, the sting of exclusion wasn't easy to ignore. She found herself walking down the sterile hallways, the echo of her footsteps bouncing off the walls like a reminder that she was alone in this. Her attempts at small talk with her new colleagues were met with stiff responses and shallow politeness, but no genuine connection. There was a sense that she wasn't truly part of the team. She was an outsider, tolerated but not fully accepted. It was a subtle, everyday battle that gnawed at her, but she had learned long ago that no one would hand her a seat at the table. She had to fight for it. When she met Dr. Mark Lawrence, a senior physician who would become one of the most prominent figures in her journey, her hope for an ally quickly dimmed. His greeting was curt, his eyes assessing her with an almost dismissive detachment. The words, "I trust you've been briefed on our protocols," were delivered without a shred of warmth, and the weight of his gaze lingered like a judgment she hadn't yet earned. Maya wasn't naive-ish. Knew this wasn't just about hospital procedures. She knew exactly what was at play here. This wasn't just about her competence. It was about her very presence. Despite the discouraging encounters, Maya clung to the lessons her mother had taught her. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't you dare let them see you falter. You've got strength in you, Maya, a strength that runs through generations of women who came before you." As she moved through the day, Maya's resolve strengthened. She wasn't there to be liked. She wasn't there to fit in. She was there to do her job, to give her best, and to prove to herself, if no one else, that she belonged. Every glance, every whispered comment, every subtle exclusion only fueled her determination. She wasn't going to break. She couldn't afford to. Not now, and not ever. Maya's journey had just begun, and the road ahead was filled with hurdles, both seen and unseen. But Maya Turner was ready. The world may have underestimated her, but she knew one thing. She wasn't just another nurse. She was someone who would carve out a place for herself, no matter how difficult or painful the path would be. Richard Harrington arrived at Willowbrook General Hospital under circumstances that seemed entirely ordinary, at least on the surface. The middle-aged businessman had suffered a skiing accident, breaking both of his arms in the process. His injuries were severe, but they weren't life-threatening, and he had been admitted to the hospital for what seemed to be standard treatment: pain management, rest, and recovery. Yet, as Maya Turner prepared to care for him, She had no idea that Richard's presence at Willowbrook would not only disrupt the routine of the hospital, but would also become the catalyst for a profound transformation in its culture. From the moment Maya entered Richard's hospital room, she could sense something was different about him. He lay in bed with his arms in casts, his expression calm and measured, as though the physical pain of his injuries barely touched him. Despite his visible discomfort, there was a quiet authority in his demeanor. He didn't act like the typical patient, the one who would be disoriented by medication or frustrated by the hospital's sterile, impersonal atmosphere. Instead, Richard was keenly aware of his surroundings, watching Maya closely with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and, oddly, seen in a way she hadn't experienced at Willowbrook before. "Good morning, Miss Turner," Richard greeted her as she walked into the room, his voice surprisingly strong for someone who had just undergone such a painful accident. He made eye contact with her, his gaze neither condescending nor dismissive, but genuine. "I've been observing the work you've been doing here," he said. "You seem quite competent at your job." Maya was taken aback by his observation. Most patients, especially those who were struggling with pain or who had just been through a traumatic event, like a skiing accident, tended to be self-absorbed, focused on their own discomfort or frustration with the hospital environment. But Richard didn't seem to fall into that category. His words felt different, as though he had not only been observing her work, but also taking stock of her as a person, something no one at Willowbrook had done for her. The encounter left her feeling somewhat vulnerable, yet strangely respected. As Maya conducted her routine checks and examined his vitals, Richard asked questions about her background. Unlike other patients who might have given little thought to the person caring for them, he seemed genuinely interested in Maya's experiences and thoughts. She answered his questions with professionalism, keeping the conversation focused on her role as a nurse. But beneath her practiced responses, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was probing for something more, trying to understand the subtleties of the hospital's environment and, perhaps, the unspoken dynamics that existed between staff and patients. "I hope you've been treated well here," Richard said quietly as Maya adjusted the bandages on his arms. "It's important, you know, to feel like you belong, especially in a place like this." Maya hesitated. It was a loaded statement, one that she knew Richard hadn't made casually. His words hit a nerve, but she didn't allow it to show. "It's complicated," she said, her voice even. She wasn't sure how much to reveal to him after all. He was just a patient, albeit an unusually perceptive one. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Complicated?" he repeated. "How so?" Maya glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. The walls she had built around herself in the hospital were high, and revealing too much would feel like opening herself up to further scrutiny and judgment. But in Richard's eyes, she saw something that made her hesitate a deep understanding, or at least the potential for it. "I'm new here," she said carefully, "and things haven't exactly been easy. It's hard to feel like you belong when people don't treat you like you do." Richard nodded, as though he understood exactly what she was saying. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "Being the outsider, the one who doesn't quite fit the mold. But you have to remember, Maya, that belonging isn't something that's given to you. It's something you take for yourself, even when the world tries to make you feel small." His words resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. Maya had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself to others, battling assumptions about who she was and what she could achieve simply because of the color of her skin. She had always been the only in spaces like this, forced to fight for her place in a system that wasn't designed for someone like her. And yet, hearing Richard's words, she felt for the first time that someone with power actually understood what it was like to be on the outside. As the days went on, Maya spent more time in Richard's room than with any other patient. Despite his injuries, he was sharp, engaged, and deeply aware of the world around him. He asked thoughtful questions about her work and her goals, but he also seemed to be observing everything that went on in the hospital, from the way the staff interacted with each other to the way patients were treated. He didn't just see the surface, he saw the undercurrents, the hidden tensions, and the subtle dynamics that were at play behind the scenes. One afternoon, Maya overheard two nurses talking about her in the hallway. They were discussing her work and her status as one of the new hires in the hospital, and their tone was laced with judgment and skepticism. "I'm not sure what they were thinking," one nurse said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's not going to last long here." Maya's heart sank as she listened, but before she could walk away, Richard's voice called out to her from his room. "Miss Turner," he said, his tone warm yet serious. "You've been doing an excellent job, but I sense there's something you're not saying, something deeper. I can see it in the way you carry yourself, even when you think no one is watching." Maya hesitated before stepping into his room. "What do you mean?" she asked. Richard looked at her, his eyes steady and unwavering. "You're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I can see it. And I've been watching how you're treated here. How people make you feel like you don't belong. I've been in your shoes. I know what it's like to feel like you have to prove yourself every single day just to be seen for what you truly are." Maya didn't know what to say. It felt as though Richard had peeled back the layers she had so carefully constructed, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. For the first time, someone was acknowledging the struggle she had endured without judgment, without pity. "I've seen how they treat you here," Richard continued, his voice lowering. "And I want you to know that you're not alone. What you're doing here matters more than you think, and I believe in your ability to change things." Maya's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty filling her. Richard's words were powerful, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to believe that things could truly change. Little did Maya know, Richard Harrington wasn't just a passive observer in her journey. His quiet influence and his deep understanding of systemic injustice were about to propel Maya into a situation that would force her to confront not only the challenges at Willowbrook, but also the long-hidden biases that permeated the very institution she worked for. Richard wasn't just a patient with a temporary injury, he was about to become her ally, and in doing so, he would change the course of her career and the entire culture of Willowbrook General Hospital. In the days that followed, Maya began to see Richard's true power not just his financial status or professional accomplishments, but his ability to recognize injustice, to stand up for what was right, and to challenge the status quo. Richard Harrington wasn't just a patient, he was a force of change, and Maya would soon realize that his impact on Willowbrook was just beginning. Richard Harrington had only been a patient at Willowbrook General Hospital for a few days, but in that short span of time, he had witnessed enough to understand that the institution, renowned for its excellence, was masking an undercurrent of inequality that was systemic, deep-rooted, and damaging. From the moment he arrived, he observed the subtle and not so subtle signs of discrimination that Maya Turner was forced to navigate every day. He noticed the way some staff members treated her differently, more critically, more distantly than her white colleagues. He saw how the hospital's culture subtly reinforced these biases, and it didn't take long for him to realize that Willowbrook wasn't a place where diversity was celebrated. Instead, it was a place where it was tolerated at best, and ignored or undermined at worst. Richard had always been someone who valued integrity and fairness, and he knew that nothing would change unless someone took action. He had seen the way Maya handled the challenges she faced with grace and professionalism, despite the constant slights she endured. He had also seen the toll it took on her how, despite her best efforts, the weight of the prejudice she faced began to erode her spirit. But Richard wasn't the kind of man who would stand by silently when he saw something wrong. The subtle injustice that Maya experienced struck him deeply, and he was determined to do something about it. It began one morning when Maya was attending to her usual duties in Richard's room. He had been recovering from his injuries, but he had become more and more vocal about the culture he was seeing at Willowbrook, especially as he spent more time observing the staff and their interactions. By now, Maya had grown comfortable with Richard's presence, and their conversations had moved beyond pleasantries. They discussed work, the hospital's treatment of patients, and, inevitably, the toxic environment that seemed to permeate the staff's interactions with Maya. She was grateful for his listening ear, but also hesitant to get too deep into it. She wasn't sure if she wanted to risk the vulnerability of sharing her struggles in a place where every mistake she made seemed to be amplified because of the color of her skin. One morning, as Maya adjusted Richard's bandages and checked his vitals, he watched her with the kind of quiet intensity he had come to display during their conversations. Finally, he spoke, his voice thoughtful but firm. "Maya," he began, "I've been observing how you're treated here. I've seen the way people respond to you, and it's not right. You're not being given the respect you deserve, not because you're not capable, but because of things you can't control, things that don't have anything to do with your professionalism or your abilities." Maya froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. She had grown used to the coldness, the subtle exclusion, but hearing it put into words by someone with Richard's gravitas hit harder than she expected. She knew it was true, but it was still painful to hear. Richard continued, his tone softer now, but no less certain. "You're doing your job well, Maya. But the people here, they don't treat you like they should. And that's not just on them. It's a reflection of the culture of this hospital, a culture that's been allowed to fester for too long." Maya's heart raced. She had long suspected that she wasn't just dealing with the individual biases of a few people, she was facing something much bigger, a pervasive culture of racism that ran through the very foundation of the hospital. But hearing Richard, a man of such influence, acknowledge it so openly made her feel both validated and exposed. She swallowed the lump in her throat, refusing to let the tears that threatened to form fall. "I've tried to keep my head down," she said quietly. "I've tried to just do my work and prove myself, but no matter how hard I try, it's never enough for some people." Richard didn't respond immediately, but his expression softened as he processed her words. "It's never enough for people like Dr. Lawrence, is it?" Richard asked, referring to the senior doctor who had made Maya's life particularly difficult with his condescending attitude and constant undermining. "I've seen the way he treats you, and I'm afraid that's not an isolated case. You're not the only one who's being treated like this. It's bigger than him. It's systemic." Maya didn't know how to answer. It had always felt like she was the only one fighting this fight, but Richard's words made her realize that she wasn't alone. He had seen what she had seen. He understood what she had been going through, and more importantly, he was willing to do something about it. That very afternoon, Richard made a decision that would change the course of Maya's life and, ultimately, the entire culture of Willowbrook General Hospital. He requested a meeting with the hospital administration, not as just another patient, but as someone with the power to make change. When Richard met with the head of the hospital and other senior administrators, he didn't mince words. He spoke plainly about what he had seen in the hospital over the past few days. "I've been a patient here for less than a week, and I've witnessed behavior that's unacceptable," Richard began. "I've watched as a nurse, a dedicated professional, has been mistreated by her colleagues, undermined by her superiors, and subjected to microaggressions and bias. I've watched as her ability to perform her job has been questioned, not because of her competency, but because of her race. And I can tell you that this hospital's reputation is not as untarnished as it may appear. The culture here needs to change." The room fell silent. Richard's words were sharp, his voice calm but unwavering. He wasn't there to complain as a disgruntled patient. He was there as a powerful advocate for fairness, speaking on behalf of a woman who had been silenced for too long. I'm asking you to take a hard look at your institution and ask yourselves if this is the environment you want to cultivate, Richard continued. I'm asking you to hold your staff accountable, to provide proper training on diversity and inclusion, and to create a culture that doesn't just tolerate diversity but values it. And I'm asking you to investigate the actions of those who have been directly responsible for perpetuating this environment, particularly Dr. Lawrence. His behavior is a symptom of a larger problem, and it cannot go unaddressed. Richard's intervention didn't stop there. He took it a step further by recommending Maya for a position that would give her the power to help fix the system from within. He urged the hospital's administration to appoint her as the head of a new diversity and inclusion committee, an initiative he knew would be crucial to the hospital's future. He knew Maya had the passion, the strength, and the insight to make real change. The response was swift. The hospital, under Richard's direction, committed to a full review of its policies and practices, and changes began almost immediately. Training programs on racial bias and inclusion were introduced for all staff, from senior doctors to the janitorial team. Dr. Lawrence was placed under investigation, and his behavior was scrutinized. The hospital's culture, which had long been one of exclusion and silent judgment, began to shift. For Maya, the changes didn't come immediately, but over time, they did. The feeling of being an outsider began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging she had never before experienced. Richard had given her more than just an ally in her fight. He had given her the tools to help lead a movement of change that would transform not just Willowbrook General Hospital, but the entire healthcare system. What started as a quiet conversation between a patient and a nurse soon became the spark that ignited a larger conversation, one about equality, fairness, and the power of individuals to make a difference. Richard Harrington had not only intervened to protect Maya, but he had also set in motion a series of events that would reverberate through the halls of Willowbrook for years to come. And in doing so, he had proven that sometimes the most powerful form of leadership is not the loudest or most obvious, but the quiet determination to do what is right. Maya's growth as a leader. Maya Turner's journey at Willowbrook General Hospital had always been defined by the struggle to prove her worth in a system that seemed designed to undermine her. From the moment she set foot in the hospital, she had faced subtle and overt challenges, not because of her abilities, but because of who she was. As a black nurse in an institution that prided itself on its prestigious reputation, Maya was made to feel like an outsider, forced to navigate a culture of exclusion and prejudice. But what Maya didn't realize as she struggled day in and day out to fit in and prove herself was that she was slowly, silently, becoming something far more significant than just a nurse. When Richard Harrington, the influential CEO of HealthGuard Solutions, intervened on her behalf, demanding changes to the hospital's toxic culture, he gave Maya something more valuable than support that gave her an opportunity. An opportunity not only to defend herself, but to reshape the very environment she had fought so hard to belong in. Richard's recommendation for Maya to lead a newly formed diversity and inclusion committee was the turning point in her career, the moment that shifted her from being a victim of the system to becoming a powerful agent of change. At first, Maya was overwhelmed by the weight of it all. She had spent so long simply surviving in an environment that often made her feel invisible, and now she was being asked to lead a movement that could transform the very culture she had struggled within. The imposter syndrome was immediate. She had always been the one who had to prove herself, had always been the one fighting for recognition, and now, suddenly, she was being handed the power to change the rules of the game. The thought of stepping into such a prominent role was daunting, but as she stood at the precipice of this new chapter, she could feel the pull of something greater than fear. It was the pull of purpose. Maya quickly realized that her leadership would require far more than just managerial skill set, would require emotional intelligence, empathy, and the ability to navigate the delicate, often difficult, Conversations about race, power, and privilege. She began by reaching out to her colleagues, both the ones who had once excluded her and those who had silently observed her struggles. She knew that true change would not come from simply punishing those who had perpetuated the toxic culture, but from fostering understanding and reconciliation. Maya's mission was to change hearts and minds, not just to enforce policies. The road was anything but smooth. Many of her colleagues resisted the changes she was advocating for. The hospital's long-held biases didn't disappear overnight, and the resistance to diversity initiatives was strong, especially among some of the senior staff. Dr. Lawrence, the same senior doctor who had made Maya's life difficult from the very beginning, openly challenged her efforts. His disdain for her ladyship was thinly veiled, and he made no secret of his belief that Maya, in his words, had earned her position because of some misguided initiative, not because of any real merit. But Maya had long since learned to let words like those roll off her back. She had faced far worse over the years, and this was just another battle to win. What was different now was her approach. Maya knew that she couldn't confront these challenges with anger or frustration. She couldn't force her colleagues to accept her vision of an inclusive workplace. She had to lead by example, proving through her actions and her results that change was not just possible, it was essential. She called meetings with department heads, conducted workshops, and engaged in deep conversations with staff about their biases, their assumptions, and the ways in which they might unknowingly perpetuate an exclusive culture. It was grueling, emotionally taxing work, but it was also deeply rewarding. Slowly, some began to listen. One of the most challenging aspects of Maya's role was navigating the unspoken dynamics of power within Willowbrook. The hospital's leadership, those who had been entrenched in the institution for decades, were reluctant to acknowledge the deep-seated problems that had festered in their own ranks. For many of them, diversity and inclusion were abstract concepts, nothing more than buzzwords. But Maya had a unique perspective. She knew what it felt like to be silenced, to be overlooked, to be the only one in the room who didn't quite belong. She used that lived experience to connect with her colleagues on a level that few could have. She didn't just talk about the importance of diversity, she showed them, through her work and through her voice, why it mattered. There were moments when Maya felt like she was losing, when the resistance seemed insurmountable, when the obstacles seemed too great, and when the weight of her new responsibilities threatened to crush her spirit. She would find herself doubting. But then, as always, she would remember her mother's words. "Don't you dare let them see you falter." Her mother had always been her anchor, the voice that reminded her of the strength within her strength that had been passed down through generations of women who had fought battles far greater than the ones she faced. And so Maya pressed on. One of the most pivotal moments in Maya's journey came when she realized that the changes she was advocating for were not just about her. They were about creating a space for other Southers like her, who had been forced to silence their voices and shrink to fit a mold that was never designed for them. Maya knew that if she could succeed in creating a culture of inclusion at Willowbrook, she could set an example for hospitals everywhere. She could show the world that real change was possible, even in the most entrenched institutions. With this newfound purpose, Maya's leadership began to shine in ways she had never imagined. The initiatives she spearheaded were not without their struggles, but they were also incredibly impactful. The hospital began to see a shift not just in policy, but in attitude. Staff members who had once been indifferent to the issue of diversity began to take it seriously. The sensitivity training, which had initially been met with skepticism, started to gain traction as people began to understand the deeper implications of their actions. The hospital's leadership, once resistant to change, began to understand that the changes Maya was fighting for weren't just about social justice, they were about better patient care, better employee satisfaction, and ultimately, a better hospital. Maya's leadership didn't stop at policy change. She was determined to be a voice for those who had no voice. She became an advocate for her colleagues, especially those who felt they had nowhere to turn. Her ladyship transformed her from a quiet survivor to a bold advocate for change. And as the months passed, it became clear to everyone at Willowbrook that Maya Turner wasn't just a nurse. She was a force for transformation. Her work didn't just improve the hospital's culture, it set a new standard for what healthcare institutions could be. By the time Maya had established the Diversity and Inclusion Committee as a permanent fixture at Willowbrook, the hospital had undergone a profound transformation. The changes, though hard-earned, were lasting. Maya had proven to herself and to everyone else that leadership wasn't about being in charge. It was about making others feel seen, heard, and valued. She had shown that one person, even in the face of insurmountable odds, could change the course of an entire institution. As she looked back at her journey, Maya realized that she had not only overcome the barriers that had once held her back, she had created a new path for others to follow. The girl who had once walked the halls of Willowbrook feeling invisible and isolated was now the woman who was leading the charge for inclusivity and change. Maya had grown not just as a nurse, but as a leader, and in doing so, she had transformed Willowbrook General Hospital into a place where everyone, regardless of their race or background, could truly belong. Systemic change and impact. The changes that Maya Turner had fought for at Willowbrook General Hospital were not just superficial reforms. They were a profound transformation that reverberated through the very core of the institution, altering its culture, policies, and ultimately the way its staff interacted with one another and with patients. What began as a personal battle for respect and fairness for Maya evolved into a broader movement for systemic change shift that would ripple outward, affecting not only the hospital but the broader healthcare industry as well. Maya's efforts had always been rooted in a simple yet powerful belief that true healthcare excellence could not be achieved without true inclusion. For too long, Willowbrook had upheld its image as a top-tier medical institution, admired for its reputation and patient outcomes. Yet beneath the surface, there were cracks deep-seated issues of racial bias, exclusion, and a lack of diversity that affected both staff and patients. These issues were not just minor discrepancies or occasional lapses in judgment, they were embedded in the hospital's DNA, shaping the experience of those who worked within its walls. Maya knew that fixing Willowbrook's culture would require nothing short of a complete overhaul. At first, the resistance to change had been strong. Many in positions of power, especially those who had grown comfortable in the status quo, believed that the hospital's reputation and success were enough to shield it from any real scrutiny. To them, diversity and inclusion were afterthoughts, or worse, boxes to check off for political correctness. But Maya, now entrenched as the leader of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, knew better. She had seen firsthand how exclusion affected her colleagues, especially those who were minorities, and how it led to a lack of collaboration, poor communication, and even worse, a detrimental impact on patient care. The hospital, for all its external prestige, was underperforming in the areas that mattered most, fostering an environment where every staff member felt valued and ensuring that patients from all walks of life received the best care possible. Richard Harrington's intervention had been the catalyst for these changes. His recognition of the systemic issues at Willowbrook had given Maya the platform and the authority to challenge the long-standing norms. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that a hospital's success was not just measured in the number of surgeries performed or the reputation of its doctors. It was measured by how well it treated everyone who walked through its doors, from the patients to the staff. Richard was not just a businessman or an influential CEO, he was a man who recognized the power of inclusion and the devastating impact of exclusion. By standing with Maya, he had sent a message to the entire hospital leadership that things had to change. No longer could the hospital operate as if its internal culture was secondary to its external success. If Willowbrook wanted to be truly exceptional, it had to prioritize the dignity and humanity of all its employees, especially those who had been marginalized. The transformation was not immediate, and it was far from easy. Change, especially in an institution as entrenched in its ways as Willowbrook, did not come quickly or without pushback. Maya faced resistance not only from senior staff members who felt threatened by her leadership, but also from a significant portion of the hospital's staff who were resistant to change. They viewed the push for diversity and inclusion as a distraction or an unnecessary deviation from the real work of medicine. For them, Maya's efforts seemed to be about something other than patient care. But Maya had a different perspective. She knew that the hospital's most critical asset was not just its physical infrastructure or its advanced technologies, it was its people. And if those people were not treated with dignity, respect, and fairness, it was only a matter of time before the cracks in the system would widen beyond repair. To achieve the systemic changes she sought, Maya had to do more than change minds. She had to change hearts. She began by making the case to her colleagues that diversity wasn't just about filling quotas or making the hospital look good on paper. It was about improving patient outcomes and fostering an environment where every staff member could contribute fully to the hospital's mission. She implemented training sessions designed not just to raise awareness about unconscious bias, but to challenge deeply held beliefs and stereotypes that had been ingrained over time. The goal was not simply to teach her colleagues that discrimination was wrong, it was to get them to understand how discrimination had hindered the hospital's potential and how inclusivity could unlock new opportunities for growth, creativity, and better care. At first, the changes were subtle. Staff members began to engage more openly in conversations about diversity. More nurses and doctors who had once remained silent in the face of prejudice began speaking up when they saw something wrong. The hospital's leadership started to acknowledge the need for change, though many of them were still hesitant to take bold action. But Maya, with Richard's unwavering support, pressed on. She wasn't content with surface-level changes. She knew that true systemic transformation would require structural shifts in how the hospital operated, from hiring practices to promotions, from the way patients were treated to how employees were supported and valued. Maya pushed for changes in how the hospital recruited staff, advocating for a more diverse pool of candidates and making sure that hiring decisions were made based on merit, not bias. She also worked tirelessly to implement mentorship programs designed to help young, diverse talent advance within the hospital. These initiatives weren't just about fairness. They were about creating an environment where everyone had the opportunity to succeed, regardless of their background. Over time, Maya began to see results. The changes she had fought for were taking hold. Staff members who had once been silent began to speak out when they saw exclusionary behavior. Conversations about race, gender, and bias became a regular part of the hospital's discourse. And most importantly, the hospital's leadership began to recognize that inclusivity wasn't just a buzzword, it was a vital component of patient care and organizational health. As the staff became more diverse and inclusive, patients began to feel the difference. They noticed that their care providers were not only more empathetic, but also better equipped to understand and meet their needs. The culture shift had a profound effect on the hospital's outcomes, and it wasn't long before the leadership began to see the undeniable link between diversity, employee satisfaction, and patient care. Maya's leadership had a far-reaching impact beyond Willowbrook. As the changes at the hospital began to take hold, other institutions within the HealthGuard Solutions network started to follow suit. The diversity and inclusion programs that Maya had championed at Willowbrook were adopted at other hospitals, and soon the ripple effect reached far beyond her own sphere of influence. What had once been a small, personal mission became a movement that spread across the healthcare industry. Maya was invited to speak at national conferences, sharing her story and the lessons learned from her work at Willowbrook. She became an advocate for systemic change in healthcare, not just in terms of diversity, but in the way institutions approached patient care, staff well-being, and community engagement. As the months passed, Maya began to realize the true magnitude of the changes she had helped to bring about. Willowbrook General Hospital had been transformed from an institution that was blind to its biases into a place where inclusion was woven into the fabric of its operations. The hospital's culture had shifted from one of silent exclusion to one of open, engaged collaboration. The work wasn't finished. There would always be more to do. Maya had achieved something profound. She had proven that systemic change was not only possible, but necessary. She had shown that when people are treated with dignity and respect, when they are given the tools and opportunities to succeed, they will rise to the occasion and change the world around them. Maya's impact was felt not just at Willowbrook, but throughout the healthcare industry. Her ladyship had become a beacon of hope for others who believed that the system could change, that their voices could be heard, and that they too could make a difference. Through her perseverance, her courage, and her unyielding commitment to justice, Maya had transformed a single institution and, in doing so, had sparked a revolution in how healthcare institutions approached diversity, inclusion, and excellence. Maya's personal transformation. Maya Turner's journey at Willowbrook General Hospital had never been an easy one. The challenges she faced were as much internal as they were external, and the weight of both was often overwhelming. In the beginning, she was just a nurse trying to make a place for herself in a system that was deeply resistant to change. She had entered the world of medicine with one goal in mind: to heal, to help, and to make a difference in the lives of others. But instead, she found herself constantly fighting not only for the recognition of her abilities, but for the right to simply be seen as an equal in an institution where she was always the outsider. When Maya first stepped into Willowbrook, she knew she would face adversity. It was a hospital that prided itself on excellence, but that excellence came with a price. Beneath its polished surface lay a culture that was far from inclusive, a system built on centuries-old hierarchies where a person's value was often determined by the color of their skin or the pedigree of their background. For Maya, this meant that every day was a battle to prove she belonged not just to her colleagues, but to herself. The subtle racism, the condescending glances, the whispered comments, it was all a reminder that no matter how talented or capable she was, she would always have to fight twice as hard as others to be seen for what she truly was: a skilled, compassionate nurse. It was in these early days of isolation and exclusion that Maya began to learn something about herself. She learned to be strong in ways she had never imagined. She learned that resilience was not just about enduring hardship, it was about surviving it with grace and dignity. Every time she was overlooked or dismissed, she learned to stand a little taller, to push a little harder, and to show up a little more, even when the world seemed to conspire against her. But even in those moments of quiet defiance, she often felt like a stranger in a world that wasn't designed for people like her. The hurt was real, and the emotional toll was heavy. Maya's personal transformation truly began when Richard Harrington, the CEO of HealthGuard Solutions, entered the picture. His unexpected intervention in the hospital's toxic culture was a turning point, not just for Willowbrook but for Maya herself. Richard, a man with immense power and influence, saw the injustice Maya was enduring and made a bold choice to support her not just as a colleague, but as a human being who deserved respect and dignity. His recognition of the systemic issues at Willowbrook gave Maya the platform to voice what she had been quietly bearing for so long. But what was even more powerful was the way Richard empowered her to take action, to not just endure the system, but to dismantle the very structures that upheld it. For Maya, this shift from surviving to leading was nothing short of revolutionary. No longer was she the passive recipient of injustice. She was now in a position to change the very culture that had marginalized her. But as the weight of this responsibility began to settle on her shoulders, Maya found herself grappling with a new set of challenges. She had always been the one working behind the scenes, quietly proving herself, but now, with the full support of Richard and the authority to make meaningful changes, she had to step into a role that was both terrifying and empowering. The fear of failure, of being rejected by those who had once dismissed her, was palpable. The old insecurities that she had buried beneath years of hard work and perseverance began to surface. In those moments of doubt, Maya drew on the lessons she had learned throughout her life. She remembered her mother's voice, always firm, always loving. "Don't you dare let them see you falter, Maya. You come from a long line of strong women who fought for what they believed in. You have that same strength in you." Her mother's words became her anchor. She realized that leadership wasn't about being perfected, was about showing up day after day and doing the work with integrity, even when it was difficult, even when it felt impossible. As Maya began to lead the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, she started to see herself in a new light. She was no longer just the nurse who had to prove herself in a system that didn't value her. She was the leader of a movement that was working to transform an entire institution. But this transformation wasn't just external, it was internal too. Maya began to understand that leadership was not just about pushing others to change, it was about changing herself. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into a system that wasn't built for her, trying to prove that she was worthy of a seat at the table. But now, as she navigated the complexities of institutional change, Maya realized that true leadership required her to stop trying to fit into the mold and start reshaping the mold itself. The challenges she faced in her new role were unlike anything she had encountered before. There were moments when it seemed like the resistance to change was insurmountable, when the road ahead felt impossibly long and the obstacles insurmountable. But as Maya worked tirelessly to foster understanding, empathy, and accountability within Willowbrook, she began to feel a shift within herself. The doubts that had once held her back began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing she was on the right path. She had always been strong, but now she was starting to believe that her strength wasn't just about enduring, it was about leading with compassion and purpose. Maya's transformation was also deeply personal. As she led the charge for systemic change at Willowbrook, she realized that her worth was not defined by the biases of others or by the narrow confines of the system she had worked so hard to prove herself within. Her worth was intrinsic, rooted in her abilities, her character, and her determination to make the world a better place, even when the odds were stacked against her. She learned that leadership wasn't about seeking validation from others. It was about validating herself, understanding her own power, and using it to create the change she had always wanted to see. The personal transformation Maya underwent didn't just impact her own sense of self-worth, it transformed the way she interacted with the world around her. The woman who had once been silent in the face of exclusion now stood at the forefront of a movement that was reshaping the very culture of Willowbrook. She wasn't just advocating for herself anymore, she was advocating for every marginalized person who had ever walked through those hospital doors, for every patient and staff member who had been overlooked, undervalued, and ignored. Maya had learned that true leadership was about lifting others up, creating space for their voices, and fighting for a system where everyone, regardless of their background, could thrive. As the months passed, Maya began to see the fruits of her labor. Willowbrook's culture started to shift, slowly but surely. More staff members began to recognize the importance of inclusivity, and the hospital's leadership took real, measurable steps to make sure that diversity wasn't just a buzzword, but a cornerstone of their operations. The work was far from over, but for the first time in her life, Maya felt a deep sense of pride in the work she was doing, not just because it was meaningful, but because it was creating a legacy that would benefit others for generations to come. Maya's personal transformation was nothing short of profound. She had gone from being a nurse who fought to be seen to a leader who had helped change the very fabric of an institution. But perhaps the most significant change was within herself. Maya had learned that she didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. She had always known what she was capable of. Now, the world was beginning to see it too. Through her perseverance, her courage, and her unwavering belief in the power of change, Maya had become not just a leader, but a beacon of hope for those who came after her. Conclusion: Maya Turner's journey at Willowbrook General Hospital was one marked by adversity, resilience, and ultimately transformation. She arrived as a nurse who, despite her immense talent and dedication, was forced to face a healthcare system that systematically undervalued her due to the color of her skin. From the very beginning, she was overlooked, isolated, and dismissed by colleagues, even though she proved herself time and time again. Yet, her strength did not lie in simply surviving these challenges, but in how she chose to respond to them. Maya learned that resilience wasn't just about enduring hardships, it was about using those hardships as fuel to drive meaningful change. The turning point in her journey came when Richard Harrington, a seemingly ordinary patient who turned out to be the influential CEO of a healthcare conglomerate, recognized the prejudice Maya faced. Richard's support provided Maya with a platform to challenge the toxic culture at Willowbrook, and he didn't just stand by her, he empowered her to lead the transformation. With Richard's help, Maya stepped into a leadership role, heading the newly established Diversity and Inclusion Committee at Willowbrook. This was a monumental shift in her journey, as she went from being someone who had to prove her worth to someone who was now reshaping the system itself. Through her leadership, Maya didn't just challenge the status quo, she transformed it. She fought tirelessly for a culture of inclusion, empathy, and fairness at Willowbrook, working not just to address the biases within the institution, but to change the hearts and minds of the people who worked there. Maya's efforts weren't without resistance, but through persistence, education, and compassion, she was able to create a more inclusive environment. Her leadership didn't stop at policy, it began to shift the collective mindset, fostering an environment where every staff member felt valued, and patients received better care as a result. Maya had learned that change wasn't about one big moment, it was about consistent, everyday efforts to break down barriers and build a culture where everyone could thrive. Maya's transformation went far beyond her professional accomplishments. As she took on her leadership role, she was also undergoing a personal transformation. She learned to see herself not just as a survivor, but as a force for change. Her confidence grew as she realized that her worth was not defined by the biases others imposed on her, but by her own abilities, values, and sense of purpose. She went from trying to fit into a system that wasn't built for her to reshaping that system to make room for others. Maya's journey from doubt to empowerment showed her that leadership comes from within, and that real change begins when we stop trying to meet others' expectations and start living according to our own truths. The legacy Maya built at Willowbrook extended far beyond the walls of the hospital. Her work sparked a ripple effect, reaching other healthcare institutions and industries, demonstrating the power of one person's willingness to stand up for what's right. She became a symbol of hope, proving that it is possible to change deeply entrenched systems when we have the courage to challenge them. Maya had not only transformed an institution, but had also shown the world that true leadership comes from the ability to create space for others and to drive change from a place of empathy and understanding. The profound lesson that Maya's story imparts is that the struggle for justice and equality is not a one-time event, it is a continuous effort that requires resilience, compassion, and, most importantly, self-belief. Maya's journey teaches us that we are not defined by the obstacles we face, but by how we choose to overcome them. In a world that often seems resistant to change, the key to creating real transformation lies in our ability to stand up for ourselves and others, to lead with purpose, and to break down the systems that perpetuate injustice. In today's world, we can apply this lesson by recognizing that change, while difficult, is always possible. Whether in our personal lives, in our workplaces, or in society at large, we must acknowledge the challenges we face and confront them head-on. Much like Maya, we can take the struggles we encounter and use them as opportunities to learn, grow, and make the world a better place for others. Maya's story reminds us that even when we feel small or insignificant, we have the power to create waves of change, especially when we work together with others who share our vision of a more just and inclusive world. Just as Maya did, we must never let others define our worth and always stand firm in our ability to make a difference. Thank you for joining this journey of kindness, transformation, and true wealth. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the power of generosity, resilience, and the unexpected ways lives can change. See you next time.